Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 5 of God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the Gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm podcaster and wannabe Klingon, Giles Goff.
And I'm sauce maker and Ferengi bartender, Phil Coleman.
Welcome back, Phil. It wasn't the same without you.
Oh.
With Natalie here, I felt like my position as the one with the sexiest voice on the podcast was threatened, but it's now nice to have things back to normal.
And look, I know I'm from Warrington, but like, it's not that bad.
Hiya, love.
Hiya, love, you're right.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
Would you like some Klingon blood wine? There you go, lovey.
And today we're going to be looking at Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the third Star Trek series and the only one thus far to be set predominantly on a space station rather than a ship. We'll be talking about the use of language in science versus faith and how to tell if your church is a cult. It's worth noting that we're going to be talking about some elements related to spiritual abuse, so if this is a tough subject for you, feel free to skip this one. Anyway, for many years, Deep Space Nine has been my favourite Star Trek series so far, but nowadays we're so spoilt for choice it's hard to say. Phil, I know you're mainly a Star Wars guy, but do you have a favourite Star Trek series?
I do. When I first moved to Manchester back in 2016, I got very much into watching Star Trek The Next Generation, specifically. Yeah. I'd always quite liked a lot of the films. Obviously the newer ones, because they're, obviously part of my generation, and some of the older ones as well. Like, I always liked Star Trek Generations. Like, for me, that was boom! But I really enjoyed TNG, just because I used to watch that when I was in my really, really rubbish apartment when I first moved to Manchester. There was rats on the floor and stuff, and it'd just be me, sat with my phone on charge next to me, watching episode after episode of The Next Generation after working a late shift at a bar. It was really comforting. And I've always really, really enjoyed that show. It's my comfort watching,
Well, that's the great thing about TNG. It is a comfort show. To me, I associate it with my childhood, and it's wonderful. I think for me, the limitations is that because it was a series set up for its syndication, all the toys had to be put back in the box at the end of an episode. So to an extent, that was somewhat limiting. The thing I enjoyed so much about Deep Space Nine was there were changes and there were consequences to what happened in it.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean, and I can see that because there's obviously quite a lot of arcs that are multi-episode spanning kind of thing in Deep Space Nine, whereas it's got more of a monster of the week or situation of the week format with TNG.
Yeah.
And there's something about that just, I don't know, there's always a resolution at the end of it. You can watch any episode of it and sort of be clued up. There might be callbacks to other episodes, but you don't really need to know. And it's quite nice.
Yeah, this was one of the first TV series, I remember at least, that had that kind of story arc, kind of a format and that approach. Anyway, let's kick off with Phil's Facts.
Star Trek Deep Space Nine is an American science fiction television series created by Rick Berman and Michael Piller. Set in the 24th century, when Earth is part of the United Federation of Planets, its narrative is centered on the eponymous space station Deep Space Nine, located adjacent to a wormhole connecting Federation territory to the Gamma Quadrant on the far side of the Milky Way galaxy. So, although we only rarely see it, there is actually an ATM in Quark's bar. And it dispenses the various types of currency used by major races visiting the station. Federation credits, Bajoran Letus, Cardassian Lex, and Ferengi Latinum. One of those things that you just think, of course there's an ATM, it's a bar.
I had no idea about that. That is awesome.
Because I've not really watched a lot of Deep Space Nine. I'm going to be looking out for that when I eventually get hooked on it and binge it in like 2 weeks. So,
Absolutely. Me and Claire have been... a woman loves you when she sits through the entirety of Deep Space Nine for you, and you can tell that she doesn't really enjoy it that much and she doesn't like it as much as TNG, but she's powered through because it means something, so it means so much to you.
That is true love right there. So when Cole Meany was fitted for his Deep Space Nine uniform, he made 2 requests of the costume designers. He explained that unlike the officers, the non-commissioned Chief O'Brien was a working man, so he needed to be able to roll up his sleeves. And he needed pockets for his tools, so the costume department altered his uniform accordingly.
That's awesome. There's a talk about Jonathan Frakes and Marina Sirtis, Commander Riker and Deanna Troi going around the Enterprise sets and looking at their costumes and like, they've got pockets. Why couldn't we have pockets?
It's like the whole thing with dresses that should have pockets, because all dresses
Absolutely.
really should have pockets. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
People got to carry stuff.
Yeah.
know what I
Come
mean?
on, lads. Patriarchy's had a good time, and listen, we all like a good handbag, but let's just have
The
pockets.
patriarchy's had fun, but it's time to give everybody pockets, okay? You know? Anyway, so Michael Dorn did not want to reprise his role as Worf, since the daily makeup application was exhausting, and he was relieved to be able to move on. Dorn said that the salary was offered made him reconsider.
I'm just picturing
obviously.
Ira Stephen Bear, the showrunner for him, and it like stood outside Michael Dorn's house, and Dorney is objecting as loudly as he can, but you just can't hear it over the sound of the money truck reversing back. You know?
Beep, beep, beep.
When Worf comes into that show, it really sort of steps up a notch. That's like when the Defiant turns up, when Worf's there, and when Sisko is bald and has his beard, that's when you know that shiz just got real, you know?
It's getting pretty real. It's no longer fake.
Absolutely.
At all. So the jar of pills, in inverted commas, in Dr. Bashir's office were actually filled with M&Ms. In many instances during the early episodes, the level of the pills would change between shots because the crew members kept stealing them. The problem was solved by epoxying the lids in place. Just glue them down.
Yeah. I remember sort of doing a set tour when I was a kid in school. There was a Welsh TV soap called Round Around, filmed in
I
Liverpool.
extras on that.
Yeah, of course you did. Everybody who knows me has extraed on that at some point or another,
totally.
because I dragged you on at some point.
I'm okay with that. I once got 40 quid for eating a bacon sandwich. It was belted.
Yeah. I mean, like, TV extra basically sort of spread out my student loan during my years. But they told us that all the chocolates and everything had been injected with something so that it would make them last longer and also would be poisonous. And I have no idea whether that was true or not, but none of us touched any of them.
That's one way of stopping people from eating the eclairs, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, definitely.
moving on. The character of Morn, played by Mark Allen Shepherd, the Lurian bar patron who is always seen sitting in Quark's bar, was written as a nod to the character of Norm Peterson, played by George Wendt on Cheers from 1982. Morn is an anagram of Norm, and the mask worn by Shepherd originally had no opening for the mouth. So makeup artist Michael Westmore gave him lips over the course of the series, just in case the character did need to speak. Unfortunately, Morn never actually said one word during the entire run of the show, leading to a running gag where bar patrons, station crew members and civilian residents often mention that Morn is excessively talkative off screen and never shuts up.
Believe it or not, there's an episode called Who Mourns for Morn. It's literally like this sort of story that Morn has supposedly died. And Quark is saying at one point, this chair, Morn's chair, must always be filled by somebody. We should do that in memory of Morn. And he gets a big bloke and gets him to sit down in it. And the big bloke is the fella that actually plays Morn, but just out of makeup.
That's excellent. I love that.
Star Trek has always been really good to its extras because Colm Meaney as Chief O'Brien was basically just meant to be an unnamed bridge officer. Michael Dorn playing Worf in Encounter at Farpoint on TNG again wasn't meant to be much more than an extra, just to show like how the enemies of yesterday could be the friends of today. So
Yeah, of course.
we like shows that are good to their extras. That's all I'm saying.
Star Trek's good.
Yeah.
Big fans.
Yeah.
And lastly, Wolf 359, mentioned as the battle site between the Borg and the Federation where Sisko lost his wife, is actually a real star that is 7.5 light years away from Earth.
Okay, like I say, I grew up with Star Trek from about 96 when I was 13. It's been part of my life ever since, you know. I know the crew complement of the Defiant, Voyager, the Enterprise D, and I can name every captain of the Enterprise from the first one through to Picard, you know. And the problem is that sometimes you don't strictly know what's an actual science thing and what is a Star Trek thing. So I found out like maybe only a few years ago that an M-class planet, a planet capable of sustaining human life, that's not an actual classification that exists in the real world.
No, I can... But, they're so convincing, you'd never bloody well know, so, like...
You talk with your other geeky friends about an M-class planet, and it just enters the lexicon, You don't...
You just say, oh, yeah.
You don't realise
it's definitely an M-class planet, that, mate. I've seen Voyager, I've seen Deep Space Nine. I know what I'm talking about. It's dead scientifically accurate, that. Transporter could therefore work, given right amount of time and right engineer. Telling you.
There's a brilliant bit where transporters wouldn't work in the real world because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, so you don't need me to explain
probably.
it. So what they did was they wrote in a thing, they just made a line about the Heisenberg compensators are out of whack or something like that.
Sorry.
Somebody rang up Michael Okuda, the technical supervisor on Star Trek TNG, and said, how do the Heisenberg compensators work? And he responded with, very well, thank you.
The Heisenberg compensators is Star Trek's version of reversing the polarity in Doctor Who. You know what I mean? It's just a catch-all, I feel. It just sort of just like, well, how does this work? Oh, we'll just reverse the polarity. Oh, it works now. Great. Anyway, that's Definitely. Me. I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So, for our guest this week is a returning guest from Season 1, all the way back in those days. Friend of the show and Star Trek expert, Stefan Austin. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name's Stefan. I am a big Star Trek fan and sci-fi fan in general. I run a local game store in my hometown. Yeah, and that keeps me very busy. Yeah.
Stefan, it is so good to have you on here. You are our Trek correspondent, and it's lovely to be talking to you again. Let's get straight to it. So, Deep Space Nine, how did that come about?
Partway through the run of Star Trek The Next Generation, it's doing really well, getting towards, Season 5, Season 6, and Paramount are looking to have a replacement show for Next Generation. They're thinking about that ending, but I also think they're looking at having another great success on their hands, and they want to sort of expand on that. So they approached Rick Berman about creating a new show. What can you do? What have you got? And Rick Berman and Michael Piller get their heads together and work on the show that would become Deep Space Nine. And really, I think they wanted something that was going to overlap with Star Trek The Next Generation. So they wanted something that was a little bit different, wasn't out on a ship, that was going to be based on a space station, so they could sort of offer something else from what TNG was already doing week in, week out. The idea of like a frontier town, there's a local sheriff, dealing with different outlaws or the frontier as such. So they put it on a space station, and they gave it the wormhole so they could sort of have lots of interesting people coming to see them. And I think, looking at when they developed it, they wanted to sort of make it a little bit easier to avoid some of the issues they'd had on TNG, writing for the drama for the characters, because on the Enterprise, everybody's Starfleet, everybody's getting on. So for conflict or drama, they've got to go, each week they've got to meet somebody new, they've got to sort of bring in somebody to bring that issue.
That's because of Roddenberry's rule, wasn't it? Yeah. He said that 24th century man would have no conflict amongst them. So all the writers were like, okay, but there's no drama without conflict. Yeah. So essentially, the conflict element was written into Deep Space Nine right from the start to deal with that problem then.
Well, I think they did it in a way so they could keep within Gene's rules of the conflict. So they base it on an alien space station. We have Starfleet characters, but we have some of the crew are not Starfleet. We have recurring characters who are on the space station who aren't Starfleet. So that gave them an opportunity to, have some sort of conflict between the characters at times, or the characters bring in their own issues that wouldn't have been able to do on TNG because everybody was from the same group, essentially.
Yeah, cut from the same cloth. So that brings me to my next question. How does it differ from The Next Generation and other Star Trek in general?
I'm going to quote Ron Moore, but he's nailed it really. Like, Next Generation is sort of a riff on the original Star Trek TV show. Deep Space Nine's probably as far as you could push it, where you've taken the Starfleet officers out of the comfortable Starfleet environment. There's a lot more sort of continuing story threads throughout the show. It deals a lot more with political, religious issues, but also family is very important in that show, and just the connections between people. In Deep Space Nine, you couldn't visit a planet. You could visit a planet. They did do that, but week in, they didn't leave that story behind and go on to the next one so much. There was sort of consequences and stayed with them a little bit more because
I remember hearing somebody say that it's not like Cisco can't go off and have fun, but Cisco has to make sure that fun doesn't turn up the next week to bite him in the ass.
That's it, and it's all going on. And it gave them a great opportunity to sort of have everything that's going on in the Alpha Quadrant, sort of to be part of that. It was less about sort of exploring Planet of the Week, more about variety of issues, I guess. Gave maybe a bit more opportunity for different storytelling.
And one thing you mentioned earlier that I wanted to sort of pick you up on, you mentioned religion in the show.
Yeah.
So why was religion so prominent in this show?
Okay, so straight from the get-go, we've got the wormhole aliens. It's sort of given us the science side of it, but also the religious side of it when in through the eyes of the Bajoran people in that show. Yeah. So that thread runs through the show, comes and goes in importance, but it's sort of you're taking a main character who has a journey from the start to the end. It's that great sci-fi thing where you might be talking about a religion or talking about issues that may or may not be relevant today in different religions, but presenting them in a different way. So it's given a fresh take on it and given it a fresh sort of way to look at it without sort of offending anyone. Or you've got people who are you've got sort of politics interwoven with religion, in terms of what's going on, what affects our characters in the day-to-day, what are their troubles, what's going on where they are sort of living at that time. Yeah. Because we said about they can't go away and leave those troubles to be dealt with. They are sort of woven into what's going on in the local area.
Absolutely. No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. Listen, Steph, it's always lovely to hear from you. Do you have anything you'd like to plug?
We have a local store in Kidderminster called Geek Retreat, and we're working very hard to create a really great safe place for people to come and hang out and game, and if they just want to chill out and have a coffee or play a board game, that's all good.
I honestly cannot wait until I can visit, because I'm going to sit there, I'm going to have a milkshake, and I'm going to play Star Trek Catan with you, because that sounds like my ideal afternoon.
That would be awesome. It really would.
Thanks, buddy.
Cheers, mate.
So, Phil, that was Steph. What do you think?
Man knows so much about Star Trek. I want to be in his Geek Retreat cafe. Also drinking milkshake. Also playing Settlers of Catan. But yeah, no, it's really nice to just hear his take on it, especially for someone who's just so invested in the series as well and in the sort of the lore of it and just the way the society works there as well. Like, he's got such deep knowledge, and just a pleasure to listen to him talk about it.
Absolutely. I played Star Trek Settlers of Catan with my wife's family, and my father-in-law, who I love deeply, kept on referring to Bajor as Badger, and I nearly flipped the table.
Oh no, it's the Badgers and the Kardashians.
Anyway, now it's time for Finding the Faith in the Film. Fantastic. There are so many different things that we could look at with regards to this show. I mean, the fact that Benjamin Sisko comes from a secular society, he gets made into a religious icon for a religion that he doesn't actually believe in, and yet somehow manages to be completely respectful of everybody's religious beliefs, I think is fantastic. And frankly, there's a few Star Trek fans out there who really could do with taking note of that nonsense, you know?
Yeah, no, I like the fact that Benjamin Sisko is like, he doubts himself, but he's so respectful at every single point from what I've seen. He just seems like a really well-measured and considerate sort of commander and captain.
Well, he's also one of my role models for being a dad. You can be sort of strong and you can be masculine, but you can also put your arm around your kid and tell them that you love them, and that sort of thing. So he's a fantastic example of what it means to be a man, I think. So we're going to focus on 2 episodes. The first one is Season 3's Destiny, where the crew are joined by 3 Cardassian scientists to explore something happening in the wormhole, but it also seems to be consistent that a Bajoran prophecy is coming true, and Sisko is put in an uncomfortable situation when having to deal with that. You watched that episode recently, didn't you?
Yeah, I quite liked it. I liked the conflict in it. Obviously, it talked a lot about faith, and it talked a lot about where does responsibility come into place when it comes to dealing with somebody else's faith and somebody else's sort of beliefs. But also as well, it had a lot of grounding in like a logical scientific explanation as well, which is something that Star Trek does so well. And I just like the fact that they were able to sort of blend those things together in this episode. I thought that was just great writing, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was intriguing.
I love that. My favourite scene is in somebody's quarters on the Defiant when Cisco is talking to Major Kira, and she's trying to convince him to stop the mission because she's seen what's the Sword of Stars, which is this sort of comet trail that looks like a sword, and it's prophesied. And he's saying, well, look, I'm Starfleet. If I have to cancel this mission, it needs to have a good reason. And the line she says, I love it. I wrote it down. She says, okay, well, you could just say to them, the prophets, the aliens who live in the wormhole, as you call them, exist outside of linear time. They know the past, present, and future. It seems perfectly reasonable that they could have communicated their knowledge of the future to a Bajoran named Chakor. He wrote down that knowledge in the form of a prophecy, and now, 3,000 years later, we're seeing these events unfold. I found that absolutely really fascinating because what we've got here is a religious event being described in scientific jargon, you know? And I thought that was fascinating that somebody wanted to try and do that.
That's exactly the scene I was thinking of when I gave my explanation a second ago. I think that's quite logical. In fact, I would even go as far to say it's quite Starfleet. And I just thinking like, yes, delicious. Thank you. Very good.
Yeah. And obviously the fun thing about Star Trek in general is it has elements of Christianity all throughout it, or elements of the supernatural throughout it. And Christianity, as a meta-narrative, simply just puts all those elements in one place. So I heard that bit that Major Kira said, and I thought I'd have a go at writing it myself, you know?
Okay.
So let me see if I can get this right. Over 3,000 years ago, a non-corporeal, omnipresent being who identified himself to Moses as Yahweh took credit for creating life on this planet. Seeing that negative qualities in the human condition could lead to ruin for not just individuals, but also the species as a whole, he left them with a series of guidelines on how to avoid destruction. And although due to his own non-linear understanding of time, he knew that humanity were ultimately flawed, he loved them anyway because he saw them as his children. How does that sound?
That's really good. But it's one of those things, it's almost like explain like I'm 5. Do you know what I mean? Like you know, it's like that subreddit. It's like explain like I'm 5. How did God convince Moses that he was God and to also, you know, give out these 10 guidelines that everyone should follow? I really like it. It creates an access point for people who do want to understand religion a bit better, even if they don't believe, but if they just want to understand. These kinds of shows are brilliant for that because they just give you they give you an in that you might not have in a sense that you may never have noticed before or may never have thought of before.
I enjoyed it because the linguist in me knows that you sometimes have to change register for certain scenarios and certain situations. You kind of have to kind of code switch, if you like. And you know that the one of the sort of founding principles of this podcast is to avoid Christianese. You know, we're not going to talk about I felt called to do X, or when I had a prophecy about blah blah blah. I try to make this as accessible to people as possible, and that's one of the things I really enjoyed about that. Obviously the danger is that if you start to mix the science fiction with the religious beliefs, then you pretty much end up with Ron L. Hubbard creating his own church based on just a load of sci-fi ideas that he had.
Yeah, I mean,
then if you're not careful, you get Scientology.
We're all seeing how that's panning out, and it's not going great.
Which leads me on to the next thing I want to talk about, and the main thing I've been thinking about really on this one. The next one I want to talk about is an episode in season 7 called Covenant, and in it Major Kira is kidnapped and taken to Empok Nor, which is basically the same station as Deep Space Nine, but it's been abandoned, or the same type of station as Deep Space Nine, but it's been abandoned, which is great because it means you don't need to build any new sets. You can just reuse the old ones and just throw up some stuff here and there. You're totally fine, you know.
Let's put up some religious stuff here. We'll have some some Cardassian stuff here, some Bajoran stuff here. It's fine.
And in the episode, Gul Dukat has now decided that he is like the emissary for the Par Wraiths, who are like the evil wormhole aliens. They're like the evil prophets. And he's basically developed this little cult of Bajoran believers who are willing to follow him and do anything that he says rather uncritically. And we have at the end a scene where they're about to commit mass suicide, and we're led to believe that he's sort of structured it in such a way that his pill is a placebo, so he'll take it and he'll survive, but everybody else will die. What did you think of that episode? episode?
It was an interesting way to sort of have a little bit of a look into how cults and religion differ, because there are so many similarities, but cults just seem so severe, and I really feel that was illustrated quite well. Like, it's severe to the point where you'd have to be of a very weak state to be sort of drawn into it, if that makes sense. And I feel like that's what Guldakat did in that episode. He saw a group of people that he could manipulate and used it to his own gain. Although he also believed he was like a prophet or like a vessel in himself. There was a lot to unpack, basically.
You're absolutely right. One of the interesting things you mentioned there was about people who are people being weak. And this seems to be a thing that people think, oh, I could never join a cult because I'm not gullible, or I'm too smart for that. Whereas a lot of the cults you'll find, you'll have some of the most intelligent people in them. I did a little bit of looking into this, and the main people who are recruited for cults are often people who are dealing with some kind of personal or professional loss, or people who have just moved to an area recently and don't have their support system. And often they are recruited by friends or family members, making it that much harder to say no,
Yeah.
So I think when we say weak, I think maybe another word to use would be vulnerable instead, because we can all be vulnerable at some point, and that makes us...
I think I meant more weakened than weak-minded, everything like that. Because if you've been affected by something and it's weakened or made your state of mind more vulnerable, as it were, I feel like that's probably more appropriate. Like I say, there's intelligent people out there who are drawn to cults, as well as people who are maybe not as intelligent. Not to say that they're any less sort of they've got any less worth than each other. I feel as though if you're feeling like you're missing something in your life, community-wise, a cult can be something that you could get drawn into really easily. So
absolutely. Now, the standard definition of a cult is a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or as imposing excessive control over members. So, we're all familiar with the traditional and the more extreme versions of what a cult is. For me, the first thing that comes to mind when I think about this is like the Jonestown Massacre or the Heaven's Gate mass suicides in 1997, where all these people sort of killed themselves on the belief that there was a starship hiding behind a comet waiting to sort of take them up. Or most recently we had the NXIVM brandings, where women were sort of being branded with a guy with the cult leader's initials to sort of show that they were part of it, in essence. What I'm interested in, it's really heavy, and of course when you've got to those extreme things, it's very easy to see, oh, that is a cult. I can tell because they're killing themselves. That's dead easy.
Big cult.
But what I'm interested
Massive cult.
Are there other cults that are perhaps more subtle versions? And that's what I wanted to look at here. So I think these days we can expand the definition of a cult to non-religious organizations, ones that don't necessarily have God or a God at the center of it. So there are various different signs that you are in a cult, and I'd urge you to seek them out. The ones that I've picked are deliberately broad enough to include non-religious examples. Okay. The first thing I think every cult has to have is a charismatic leader with all the power focused on them.
Yes.
If we took something like QAnon, which I think has essentially turned itself into a cult, Donald Trump is absolutely at the center of that cult of personality, where everything he says and everything he does is right. Everything he does is excusable. You with me?
Yeah, of course. Like, everything that he does, it's like, well, he's saying it, so it must be right. So other people outside, they're just like, are you sure?
Yeah. Another thing that I think you can see is a hierarchical structure that doesn't allow for criticism or meaningful discourse. It's like the flow of information can only go one way, and it goes from the leader down to the followers, if you like. There's a real discouragement of critical thinking in it.
Absolutely.
And one thing I think that's really important in all cults that I've seen is that at the center of it, there's got to be a cause that will justify extreme lengths to achieve that goal.
Yeah, of course.
Like, it can either be about self-improvement, or it can be about saving the children or whatever. You rarely get cults that are based around selling coffee.
Yeah, it's usually something quite life affirming, something that is changing something that's like at your core or at the core of society. That's sort of where the cult is focused on.
Another aspect I thought was a heavy emphasis on extreme signs of loyalty from the people that are following it, and that could be either sort of finances, work, or other things. You know,
it's like I'd die for this person. I'd give all my savings for this person. That kind of thing. You know.
I mean, basically, yeah. On the more extreme end, we then start talking about sexual exploitation. But like I say, I don't think you even need to go that far for it to be a severe problem. And the last thing I wanted that I thought was important was a strong discouragement of leaving. You know, that
100%.
This small group here, they're the ones that have got it right, and if you leave that group, then you're in the wrong.
Yes, I can think of a few examples where that is very much apparent, and it's frightening because people that are in this sort of situation, they are led to believe that the only path is their path, and any other path will lead to death, destruction, chaos, and debauchery. Well, it's just not fair at the end of the day because it's simply untrue.
So what I wanted to talk about was the idea of, like I say, whether cults have to be religious or not. And do you know what the first thing I thought that I picked on? The first cult that came to mind for me.
I cannot wait to hear this, to be honest.
Okay. Have you heard of CrossFit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of CrossFit, yeah.
I spoke with Griff, a personal trainer friend of mine, and he had a joke like the first rule of CrossFit is you've always got to talk about CrossFit, God. And whilst it might not be strictly a cult, it has certain things. I spoke to my friend Anne, who is by far one of the smartest people I know, and she was a member of a CrossFit gym or a CrossFit box for quite some time. And one of the things I said to her was, quick question, have you ever heard anyone compare CrossFit to a cult? And she went, yep, me. So,
amazing.
And I said, I wonder whether it fit the criteria. And she said, I think it was arguably a cult when Greg Glassman was in charge. Charismatic leader, special language, induction into new ways, promises life transformation, takes over life and takes lots of money. And with Greg gone, there's no charismatic leader. And the fun thing she said was it came as part of a discussion with a fellow Christian on how it was easier and more successful to invite friends to CrossFit than to church, possibly because the evidence of changed life was more obvious, and equally sadly, a good CrossFit community was more supportive than many churches. However, it did in Glassman's time tick the spot the cult boxes, although I wouldn't call it an actual cult.
I totally see it. It is. It's got culty tendencies, hasn't it? It's got some cultiness, if that is a term.
Another one that is rife for this sort of thing is, have you ever heard the term NGO?
It does ring a bell, but I couldn't tell you what it means.
Okay, so an NGO stands for non-governmental organisation. A lot of the time, what that usually means for us is just charities. Organisations that work in the charitable sector who are trying to do good in some way, shape or form, who are not directly sponsored by the government. You with me?
Yeah, I get you.
So these often have the good cause thing that I'm talking about. Because if you're trying to do something that is helping children in Africa or helping people to do X, Y, or Z, and it's definitely a good cause, then it's easier to justify making people show those extreme signs of loyalty and going to extreme lengths. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's kind of an ends justify the means things, I suppose. At the end of the day,
Exactly.
We're saving starving children. We did have to kill a few people to get there. Oh, we did have to steal these people's money. But hey, the kids survived. Do you know, it's maybe that was a little extreme, but you see my point.
I do see where you're going for. So the example that comes to mind is a friend of mine used to work for a charity that was like an anti-trafficking charity, so it's fighting against modern slavery.
Yeah.
So it had the thing of ticking all the main boxes. It had the charismatic leader. It had a structure that didn't really give any any room for sort of complaint. So, for example, the boss's wife was the head of HR, you know? So you can't...
Yeah, okay.
And obviously, you've got young, idealistic people who want to join this organisation because they want to do something about this thing that they're passionate about, you know? But then they're expected to sort of work extremely long hours. They're expected to sort of go above and beyond. And that sort of always doing more than you expect to do becomes kind of fetishized. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. That sounds exactly like hospitality. The amount of times that I've been subject to that in my working life, just in general, because they sort of nurture that sort of attitude so that they can get more out of their staff for less pay. And it's wrong, because it's a hard job.
Yeah.
And one, we shouldn't be working that many hours, and we should just all be getting paid more.
Yeah. But the key difference there is that you don't have the goal, the mission statement that kind of keeps you there. Do you know what I mean? You're like, okay, well,
totally.
I can pour pints somewhere else where they treat me a bit better, you know? This sense that of doing something good starts to become part of your identity, and then your job starts to take over who you are. And then the thing about this good cause is that it starts to cover a multitude of sins.
Yeah.
So if we take the charismatic leader aspect, you say, well, I didn't like him when the way he treated me, or the way he said this, or how he talks to that person. But then again, he is trying to end slavery. So
it's one of them things that it's like, yeah, maybe, but you also shouldn't have done that, and you should have some respect for your individuality and yourself, you know.
Yeah, it starts to become a thing where it gives somebody a license to mistreat people because of what their goal is, their end goal at the end. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I totally understand that. I just think it's abhorrent, to be honest. I find it a very frustrating concept that people do that.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this. It occurred to me the more I was writing about this, the more I thought, flipping heck, this is schools. If you think it through, like every sort of person gets recruited. They have to see their competitors. They have to work hard to become a part of it. And then when they get there, they're expected to go above and beyond. You're expected to know the special educational needs, or the educational needs of every child in every class. You're expected to differentiate for every child at all times. You're expected to be thinking about showing meaningful learning for every single lesson every time, so that if somebody walks in, they can see you doing this, that, and the other. And the amount that is asked of teachers for the children is ridiculous.
It's like the adverts that you see on television for that are recruiting for people to get into teaching jobs, but that are put out by the government. They always sort of like put it across as being like, this is a vocational position. This is something that is there for the betterment of society. It's good for you. It's good for the kids. They don't talk about the crippling hours. They don't talk about the pay that isn't worth it. They omit all of that because that's obviously very, very much disheartening for anybody who wants to get into teaching.
Yeah, and there's a real strong discouragement of leaving. I mean, first of all, if you want to quit, you've got to put in like effectively 3 months notice. You have to give terms notice before you leave. But also there's this idea that, oh, you couldn't hack it, and it's like, no, it's not that I couldn't hack it. It's because I was expected to put my dreams and my life on hold in order for somebody else to show that they had led this school to get higher grades so that they could get a headship somewhere else, I
really, really hate that sort of notion of, you couldn't hack it. Oh, you're just giving up, eh? It's like, no. What I'm doing is I'm putting myself first, and you should probably try it yourself too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's ridiculous.
Well, as a teacher, your main learning resource is yourself. And if you're not looking after yourself, then it really doesn't matter whether your resources are color coordinated or anything like that. You have to put yourself first in these things,
100%.
Obviously, we're a God in film podcast, so we probably should talk about how this relates to sort of churches, because
true.
I've had two very conflicting experiences of this. I've been in a church that felt like a cult, and I've been in a church that felt nothing like a cult, The church I got saved in back in Bangor had a lot of these kind of elements that we talked about. It had the charismatic leader with all the power focused on them. It had a hierarchical structure that didn't allow for criticism or meaningful discourse. The leader of that church, you met her, you interviewed her. We won't use her name.
Oh, yeah, I remember, yeah.
Yeah. Normally, for a church leader, for a pastor to be running a church, church, they will have to sort of answer to either a governing body or like a higher organization. You with me?
Yeah.
But the way that the Pentecostal organization sets up churches, they kind of set up churches and then they kind of let them kind of sink or swim. They give them very little oversight. And for this church leader, let's just call her Karen for the moment. That's not her name. It's nothing close to her name. But for most church leaders, they would have like a governing body or deacons or something like that to answer to. You with me?
Yeah, of course.
So this church leader, our Karen, she appointed that governing body herself.
See, that's alarm bells
So
right there, isn't it?
all the people who are meant to be a check and a balance on everything she does were people that she put in the position herself.
Yeah, that's not really how any of that works, really. It's not really how my understanding of the church works.
Because you're going to pick people who won't challenge you. You're going to pick people who won't say, no, that was out of line and you shouldn't have done that. You're
going to pick yes people because you want to solidify your position of power, if you have a position of power or authority.
And of course, in any church, in every church, you have a cause that will justify extreme measures to achieve that goal. We obviously want people to become Christians because if you believe what we believe, then we want you to know God, because the other option is not favourable, to say the least. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I totally understand.
So because of that, she felt like she was able to say to people that if you really love God, you should sell your house to sort of give money to the church, you know? There was one time where she said that if you're not coming to church on a Sunday morning and a Sunday evening, then you're cheating God. You with me?
I'm going to be honest, right? Why don't she sell her house? Do you know what I mean? Like, just sell your own bloody house. Don't ask other people to sell their houses. I've got stronger words that I won't be using, but that's really angry.
And there was a heavy emphasis on extreme signs of loyalty that you would be coming morning and evening, and you'd also be going to the prayer meetings on Friday mornings, and that you'd be helping out with the youth leader, all this sort of stuff, you know. There was also a strong discouragement of leaving, because like as Christians, we believe that you can't be a good Christian on your own. You know, you've got to be able to talk to people and you've got to be part of a team. So we don't want you to leave church in general. But that said, if you leave our church and go to another church, that's okay. You know, we're fine with it. This church had a strong belief that they were the only ones who were really following God. They were the only ones that were, the phrase that you hear is on fire for God. And the other ones were like sort of almost like dead churches, that sort of thing.
On fire for God?
That's a regular phrase, idea that you're full of passion with...
There's very little I'd be on fire for. Do you know what I mean? Just in general. That's a good
Now
phrase.
that I say it out loud... It does sound a little bit weird.
It sounds a little bit like immolation, is what it sounds like. You know what I mean? It just makes me think of the front cover of Rage Against the Machine's first album.
Yeah. As I say, there are certain aspects where cults and just church in general will have some things in common. Mm-hmm. So if you're part of a church, you are expected to contribute financially. But the way somebody said to me was like, well, if you're part of a family, you'd be expected to do the dishes sometime, every so often, you know?
Yeah, no, I get that.
If you think what they're doing is worthwhile, then you need to contribute something to it. So you've got to do something to keep the lights on. But the key difference being, rather than say you need to give this much or you need to give everything, the phrase that we have in our church is joyful givers. Mm-hmm. That God wants joyful givers. He wants people who are happy to give. So the way that manifested for me was picking them out in your head that you're going to be happy to give, and nobody's checking up on me to see if I'm doing it. Nobody's saying, oh, it should be this or it should be that. Nobody even really talks about it that much, you know? And if I'm struggling, as I have done financially in the past, and I needed to save money, I've stopped my direct debit going out there, and nobody said anything. No one's treated me differently or anything like that.
No,
you know?
That's the thing, though. It's the end of the day. It's like family. You look out for them. You try and take care of them, whether that's financially or other. But it's not an expectation. It's just, if you can, then do. But if you can't, then don't worry about it, because
Yeah.
we'll love you all the same.
Absolutely. And in terms of a hierarchical structure, the idea that it all comes to sort of one person. So we do have a senior leader, but in terms of like the organizational structure,
Yeah.
if you want something doing, he's almost like the last person to come to, because I thought if I wanted to do something in church that you'd have to sort of like take it to a committee or a leadership group or something, and they would sort of have to give you like almost like a papal seal of approval. But what I found was that if I wanted to do something in the church, I just talked to my mate Sue, who kind of is like the office manager, and if she says, yeah, I reckon that's probably fine, that's pretty much as close to a papal seal of approval as you're going to get,
That's kind of all you need, you know what I mean? Like, I come back to the restaurant analogy just for a moment, like, but when you're a manager in like a restaurant or in a bar or whatever, you're the person who's helping everyone else. You're not the overlord. You're like everybody's sort of like, busboy at the end of the day. You're doing everything for everyone else, and I feel like that's sort of the way it should be. You should be everyone's leaning post and everyone's support.
It's like that. It's sort of that thing that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. All that sort of thing, and the fact that like Jesus modelled this by sort of, he wasn't afraid to do the dirty jobs. He wasn't afraid to sort of get his hands dirty and wash people's feet, which would have been sweaty and dusty and disgusting and all the rest of it. And if you've got a leader who feels like they're too good for that sort of thing, then you probably want to stay well away from them.
I've met many of them, and I distance myself accordingly.
And in terms of our hierarchical structure, we have a senior leader, we have an associate pastor, we have an operations manager, we have an eldership team, we have a group of trustees, and it's this weird system of checks and balances all the way going through. Like, there's a point where I'm not entirely 100% sure who my boss is sometimes, because you've got responsibility for this, so I've got to talk to you about this, and then you've got that, and I really enjoy the messiness of it. Do you know what I mean?
I feel like you need like some kind of stem and leaf diagram or something, just to figure out, like a family tree almost, like just to try to figure out who the hell I speak to for this and who do I speak to for this. It is
a very flat organizational structure, is the way I would put it.
I think that works.
I absolutely love that about it. That rounds up our quite rambling finding the faith in the film section. My sincerest apologies if that wasn't usually the same kind of absolutely clinical Bible references all around and the rest of it. Now, Phil, I have a bone to pick with you.
Oh, goodness. What have I done now?
We've not had a review as such, but we did have a message sent to us in the on Facebook via a guy called Elliot Rowe, and this was sent on the 22nd of June that you responded to, and I knew nothing about. So, I mean, you know what I'm like. I'm so desperate and begging for validation that anything there, it's like, oh, yes, please give me some crumbs that somebody's paying attention.
In my defence, I genuinely thought you may have seen it. I just didn't think to mention it. I'm sorry. My apologies. I'll keep that in mind in future.
So I'm going to read out what Elliot said. You guys make a brilliant podcast. A few months ago, I was fancying an Indiana Jones podcast to listen to, and so typed that into Apple Podcasts, and your episode about it came up, and I thought, well, this is just perfect. As a Christian and fellow lover of film myself, this is absolutely perfect, and I've even pointed the youth at our church to listen to it, as they have asked about how to love fantasy well whilst being a Christian. I lived in Stockport and so found it hilarious when Phil pointed out that somewhere being not of the Lord reminded him of Stockport. You both do a brilliant job. Great to see such good friends having a laugh.
Oh,
so that was from Elliot Rowe, and
I remember that one now, and thank you so much, Elliot. It really made me smile. It really did.
Thank you, Elliot. That absolutely made our day. Listen, guys, thank you so much for joining us once again. We love that you're ready to listen to us ramble on about stuff. Our next episode is going to be on Buffy and Angel, and we hope to see you then. In the meantime, Phil, have you had a good time?
Oh, I love talking about cults. So I had a great time.
Me too. Okay, guys, we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff and Phil Coleman. Mixing by Phil, editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by Julie Walsh, and our theme tune was composed by Rick Lee. who also did the Waffle edit. Got It Film is a Dask production. Please rate and review, unless it's a 1-star, in which case, record your comments onto an isolinear rod as a subspace message could be picked up by the Dominion. Take the Rio Grande runabout to Empok Nor's last known location. Dock up a pylon too, but do not enter the station. Just leave the rod in the airlock, and Phil will get back to you when he's next in the sector. Giles out.